The conference room smelled like expensive leather and cheaper ambitions. I was debugging a certificate rotation when Garrett Blackwood dropped his little announcement like a grenade wrapped in corporate speak. Effective immediately, we're streamlining our technical resources, he said, not bothering to look up from his iPad. His voice carried that particular brand of Silicon Valley arrogance, the kind that comes from confusing venture capital with actual competence. Zara, your access will be revoked by close of business. Zara. Not our lead systems architect. Not the woman who built 70% of our infrastructure. Just my first name, delivered with the casual indifference of someone ordering a latte. I stopped typing. The room went cemetery quiet, that special kind of corporate silence that happens when everyone knows they're witnessing an execution but nobody wants to be the one holding the axe. Garrett continued scrolling through his presentation slides, probably rehearsing buzzwords for his next investor pitch. We're consolidating legacy responsibilities under newer frameworks. More agile, you understand. Legacy. There's that word again. As if 12 years of architectural foundations were something you'd find gathering dust in a museum instead of humming quietly in the server room, keeping their entire operation alive. I closed my laptop with a soft click. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the suffocating quiet. Nobody met my eyes, not the CTO who'd approved every design decision I'd made, not the legal counsel who'd watched me navigate 3 major compliance audits, not the CFO who knew exactly how much money my infrastructure had saved them. Any questions? Garrett asked, finally glancing up with the kind of smile that belonged on a shark. I had plenty of questions. Like whether he knew that every critical system in this building traced back to authentication protocols I'd personally designed. Whether he understood that the upcoming merger, the $300 million acquisition that would make or break this company, depended entirely on validation sequences he couldn't even pronounce. But I didn't ask. Instead, I stood up, tucked my laptop under my arm, and walked toward the door. Zara, the CEO called after me. His voice carried just a hint of something that might have been guilt. Thank you for your contributions. I paused at the door, my hand on the brushed steel handle. You're welcome, Mr. Henley. Good luck with the transition. The elevator ride to the parking garage gave me exactly 93 seconds to process what had just happened. 93 seconds to transform from employee to former employee. 93 seconds to decide whether I was going to rage or plan. I chose plan. The thing about building systems in the shadows is that you learn to leave breadcrumbs, not maliciously, but practically. When you're the only person who understands how something works, you document it. You create failsafes. You build in redundancies. And sometimes, when corporate politics get particularly ugly, those failsafes become leverage. I drove home through downtown traffic, past billboards advertising fintech solutions that probably used components I'd helped architect. The irony wasn't lost on me. Half the city ran on infrastructure that bore my digital fingerprints, but according to Garrett Blackwood, I was legacy. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my personal archive. Not company property, my own documentation, maintained separately, meticulously organized, and completely legal. Years of architectural decisions, design rationales, and system dependencies that I'd tracked because nobody else bothered to. The crown jewel of this archive was something I called the Phoenix Protocol, a comprehensive map of every critical system dependency in the company's infrastructure. Named after the mythological bird because I'd always suspected that someday, someone would try to burn down what I'd built, and I'd need to rise from the ashes to resurrect it. The Phoenix Protocol contained something particularly interesting, detailed documentation of the trans-secure validation system, the backbone of the company's escrow functionality. The same escrow functionality that would be stress-tested in exactly 6 days during the merger validation process. The same system that required authentication from an administrative account registered under the name Zara Chen, my grandmother's maiden name, chosen years ago when I needed a fallback administrator identity that couldn't be accidentally deleted by some eager intern. I smiled, taking another sip of wine. Garrett had revoked my corporate access, but he didn't know about Zara Chen. Nobody did. It was buried 3 levels deep in authentication hierarchies that most people assumed were handled by the system. The system. As if it were some autonomous entity that maintained itself. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 unread messages. I ignored them all and went for a run instead, my usual 5-mile loop through the hills above the city. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and the distant promise of chaos. When I finally checked my phone, the messages painted a clear picture. The merger validation had been moved up. Today. Right now. And something was going wrong. The first message was from Trevor Singh, one of the junior developers. Zara, the escrow system is throwing authentication errors. Can you help? The second was from legal, urgent, need technical consultation on validation protocols. The third was from Garrett himself, call me immediately. I deleted them all without responding. Instead, I made myself breakfast, steel-cut oats with fresh berries and a perfectly timed soft-boiled egg. I ate slowly, methodically, while somewhere across town, a $300 million merger hung in the balance because nobody had bothered to ask the legacy architect how anything actually worked. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Garrett Blackwood. I let it go to voicemail, then played it back on speaker while I loaded the dishwasher. Zara, I need you to call me back immediately. There's been a situation with the validation system. We need your expertise to resolve some technical issues before the buyer's audit team arrives. Expertise. Interesting how that word had evolved overnight from legacy to expertise. I called him back at exactly 10:47 a.m., after I'd finished my coffee and reviewed the morning news. Garrett, I said when he picked up on the first ring. You wanted to speak with me? Zara, thank God. Look, there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, I interrupted. You terminated my access yesterday. Quite clearly, if I recall. Something about legacy frameworks and newer paradigms? Silence. Then, we need you back. The escrow validation system is locked out. The merger depends on this. I see. And what exactly would you like me to do? I'm no longer an employee. I don't have access to your systems. We can restore your access. Temporarily. I let the pause stretch. Power lives in silence, in the space between demand and response. I'll need that in writing, I said finally. From legal. With specific terms. What kind of terms? Full system access. Administrative privileges. And a written acknowledgement that the trans-secure validation system was designed and implemented by me personally. Another pause. Zara, that seems? Those are my terms, Garrett. Take them or solve this yourself. I hung up. The callback came 18 minutes later. This time it was Rebecca Henley, the CEO herself. Zara, we'd like to discuss bringing you back in a consulting capacity. I'm listening. Full access, administrative privileges, and proper attribution for your work on the validation system. Plus consulting fees at market rate. What's market rate for preventing a $300 million deal from collapsing? Name your price. I named it. She didn't even counter. An hour later, I was walking back into the building I'd left in disgrace less than 24 hours earlier. The security guard who'd watched me surrender my badge yesterday now handed me a temporary access card with an apologetic smile. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt different this time. Instead of defeat, I carried the quiet satisfaction of inevitability, the same feeling you get when you watch dominoes fall in a pattern you designed. The conference room was packed. The buyer's team had flown in from Singapore, serious people in expensive suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Our legal team sat rigid with stress. The CTO kept checking his phone like it might spontaneously generate solutions. And there, in the corner, sat Garrett Blackwood, looking like a man who'd just realized his parachute was actually a backpack. "Zara," Rebecca said, standing as I entered. "Thank you for coming back." I set my laptop on the conference table and opened it without ceremony. "Where do we stand?" Trevor Singh, bless him, had compiled a comprehensive error log. The trans-secure system had been rejecting authentication attempts since 6 a.m., when someone had tried to initialize the validation sequence for the merger audit. "The system keeps asking for Zara Chen authorization," Trevor explained. "But we can't find any employee records for that name. It's not in our directory, not in HR files, not anywhere." "That's because Zara Chen isn't an employee," I said, pulling up the authentication hierarchy on my screen. "It's a fallback administrative account I created for exactly this situation." The room went quiet. The buyer's lead counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Lim, leaned forward with interest. "You created a personal backdoor?" Garrett asked, and I could hear the accusation building in his voice. "I created a redundant authentication pathway," I corrected. "Standard practice for critical systems. When the primary administrative accounts are compromised, or, say, when someone terminates the architect's access without understanding the dependencies, the fallback prevents total system failure." Dr. Lim smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "So you're telling me that your former employee is the only person who can authorize this validation?" "Former employee who was rehired this morning," Rebecca corrected quickly. "Under consulting terms." "Fascinating," Dr. Lim said. She made a note in her legal pad. "And this Zara Chen account, it requires what, exactly?" I pulled up the authentication interface. "Biometric verification linked to my personal credentials. Fingerprint and retinal scan, specifically." The CTO, a man named Harrison who'd never written production code but had strong opinions about architecture, looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "That seems like a security risk." "The security risk," I said calmly, "would be building a critical system without fallback authorization. Which is what you would have had if I hadn't planned ahead." I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner and leaned forward for the retinal check. The system beeped softly, and suddenly every screen in the room showed a status I hadn't seen in months: full access authorized. "Now," I said, turning to Dr. Lim, "shall we run your validation sequence?" The next 4 hours were a masterclass in competence. Every test the buyer's team threw at our system, every edge case they probed, every security question they asked, I had an answer. Not because I was particularly brilliant, but because I'd built the system to be answerable. Every component had documentation. Every decision had a rationale. Every potential failure had a contingency. This wasn't just code, it was architecture. The difference between a house and a home, between function and reliability. By 3 p.m., Dr. Lim was nodding approvingly at her checklist. "Outstanding work," she said, closing her laptop. "The system exceeds our security requirements by a significant margin." She looked directly at me. "Miss Chen, I assume you'll be overseeing the integration process?" Before I could answer, Garrett jumped in. "Actually, we're transitioning Zara's responsibilities to our internal team." "No," Dr. Lim said flatly. "The system architect oversees integration, or we walk away from this deal." The room froze. $300 million hanging on 4 words, or we walk away. Rebecca looked at Garrett, then at me, then back at Dr. Lim, of course. "Zara will handle the integration personally." That evening, I sat in my newly assigned office, corner suite, 20th floor, with a view of the bay, and reviewed the integration timeline. 6 months of technical oversight, system optimization, and knowledge transfer. 6 months to build a team that actually understood what they were maintaining. 6 months to document everything so thoroughly that even Garrett Blackwood couldn't accidentally break it. The knock on my door came at 7 p.m. Rebecca entered without waiting for permission, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression that might have been respect. Long day, she said, setting one cup on my desk. Productive day. She sat down across from me. I owe you an apology. You owe me a conversation about why this happened in the first place. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee like it might contain answers. Garrett thought we needed fresh blood. Newer approaches. He convinced the board that legacy systems were holding us back. And you believed him? I believed the financial projections he showed us. 20% cost reduction through streamlined technical resources. She made air quotes around the phrase. I didn't realize that streamlined meant removing the person who actually built the systems. Now you know. Now I know. She looked up at me. I also know that we can't afford to make this mistake again. Which is why I'm offering you the CTO position. I set down my coffee cup carefully. What about Harrison? Harrison will be transitioning to a strategic advisory role. Translation: golden parachute to nowhere. And Garrett? Rebecca's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Garrett is exploring new opportunities in the startup ecosystem. I considered the offer. CTO meant budget authority, hiring decisions, and strategic oversight. It meant never again having to watch while someone who'd never debugged a production system tried to dismantle what I'd built. It meant power. Real power, not just technical expertise. I'll need to rebuild the entire technical team, I said. Whatever you need. And I'll need a written commitment that architectural decisions go through me personally. Done. And Garrett's office. I want Garrett's office. Rebecca laughed, a genuine sound that I hadn't heard from her in years. It's yours. 3 months later, I stood in that office, looking out at a city that hummed with digital infrastructure I'd helped design. The merger had closed successfully, the integration was ahead of schedule, and I'd hired 6 new engineers who actually understood the difference between legacy and foundational. My desk held a framed photo from the company's annual report. The technical team gathered around a server rack, all of us smiling with the confidence that comes from building things that last. The nameplate on my desk read Zara Chen, Chief Technology Officer. No longer legacy. No longer shadow. Just the architect, finally getting credit for the blueprint. My assistant knocked and entered with a stack of resumes. The candidates for the senior systems architect position, she said. I flipped through them, looking for something specific, not just technical skills, but the kind of thoroughness that comes from understanding that today's innovation is tomorrow's foundation. Schedule interviews with these 3, I said, marking the candidates who showed evidence of actually thinking beyond the immediate problem. And make sure they understand, I added, that in this company we document everything. Because you never know when someone might try to call your work legacy. She smiled and headed for the door, then paused. Oh, and Dr. Lim from the Singapore office called. She wants to discuss expanding the validation framework for their European operations. Tell her I'll call her back this afternoon. As the door closed, I turned back to the window. Somewhere in this city, other architects were building systems, solving problems, creating the invisible infrastructure that kept everything running. Some of them were probably invisible too, working in the shadows, building foundations that nobody noticed until they tried to tear them down. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to our technical blog. On the importance of documentation, why your future self and your company will thank you. Because the best revenge isn't destruction, it's making sure that next time, they remember who built the castle before they try to tear down the walls. And if they don't remember, well, that's what documentation is for. 6 months after this story, Zara Chen was featured on the cover of Tech Architecture Quarterly. The headline read, "The Phoenix Protocol, How One Architect Saved a $300 million Deal by Planning for the Worst." Garrett Blackwood's startup failed during series of funding. The investors cited fundamental technical architecture concerns. Some patterns, it seems, are harder to break than others.